Okay, thank you very much. Tonight we have Geoff Russell, and he's going to talk on wild sex, the implications. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Geoff.
Thank you, Kevin, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming along and participating in this. I want to clarify something at the outset. What is the subject tonight is not wild sex by Geoff Russell, but it's wild sex, the implications, and I am to be the speaker to that subject. So welcome to that. Now, I want to tell you how this came about. About a year ago, as I was browsing through some secondhand books in a local op shop in Blackwood, I came across a book with an intriguing title. It was Wild Sex, All You Want to Know About the Birds and the Bees. Here it is, and it's a hardback book. It's written by Susan Windybank, who's an Australian in Sydney, and it's subtitled, as I said, All You Want to Know About the Birds and the Bees. It was published in about 1991. Well, when I saw that book, how could I resist? And its price was only $3. So I bought the book and I've since read it. And on the book cover, just to give you a little background about the author, Susan Windybank is described as an avid fisher person, bird watcher and butterfly collector. She's also an experienced print and radio journalist with a keen interest in natural history and the environment. And she began writing this book while covering a story on the breeding cycle of sperm whales. And after wading through realms of scientific jargon, she realised that this fascinating area of study needed a more populist approach, and the book Wild Sex was conceived. So we now have this book. It is a populist approach, as she says. It's not a scientific book as such, but nonetheless, it's got a great deal of very interesting information in it. Well, I must say that I thought I knew quite a lot about the birds and the bees before I began reading this book, but I did learn a lot more from this book. It's not a scientific treatise, but it's fascinating. And I would commend the book to you. But before we get into the subject tonight, I want to make 4 preliminary remarks. First of all, I'm going to be talking about sexual reproduction, sexual attraction and intercourse. I don't intend my presentation to be titillating or flippant, but I do want it to be accurate and interesting. Secondly, I'm not a professional biologist. I have studied science subjects at tertiary level, but not biology. So please be lenient with me if I use incorrect terminology or if my terminology is not strictly correct. I think you'll know what I'm talking about. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking more about the implications of what we know about sex rather than just talking about sex itself, though there will be quite a lot of facts about sex in it, especially to get us to the point of drawing implications. And fourthly and finally, though there are many sources of the materials in my presentation, this is my own work. I do acknowledge the book Wild Sex in particular, and I acknowledge Wikipedia, which I've consulted on a couple of occasions. Okay, now into our subject. Almost all living things reproduce sexually. That is, a male element of a species combines with a female element of that same species, resulting in a progeny, a reproduction, a new unit of that same species. Many species of vegetation reproduce sexually, but I'm going to limit my consideration to just the animal world. Almost all animal species, and there's more than 1 million species, I don't know the estimated number at the moment, but it's well over 1 million, almost all species reproduce sexually, but there are some which are regarded as the simple forms of life, although even the simplest form of life is fantastically complex. There are, as I say, there's some which reproduce asexually, that is, without sex. Their basic method of reproduction is that one unit of the species simply divides into 2 or more, which in turn divide again and again and so on and multiply. At this point already, I want to draw some implications from what we know so far. I ask the question, why is there reproduction at all? Well, because a living thing does not need to reproduce in order to be alive itself. It's obviously for something else than the life of that individual. All living things die. Obviously, if a species did not reproduce, then not only would individuals of that species die, but the entire species would terminate and become extinct. If no species reproduced, all life would come to an end. Now, there's nothing inherently necessary, considering the natural world. If we limit ourselves to just the natural world, there's nothing inherently necessary for the continuation of life from one year to the next. The Earth, it seems, is really unique in the universe. As far as we know, it is the only place where animal life as we know it exists. And if there was no animal life, the Earth and the universe would continue to exist all the same. That's the case, of course, for all the other planets in our solar system, for the sun itself, and for satellites of planets. They all exist perfectly well, so it seems, without any animal life whatsoever. So there's no necessity in the natural world itself for living things to reproduce, but nonetheless, every single species of living thing that we know, over 1 million of them, all have the facility to reproduce. The implication of this, in my mind, is that all the methods of reproduction have actually been designed. They've been designed in every species of living things so that life on Earth will continue. Because as I've said, if there wasn't reproduction, life would cease. So it seems that there's a purpose in reproduction, and the ability of every living species to reproduce, and that purpose seems to be the continuation of life here on planet Earth. And if there's a design, then that implies a designer, who is God. That's the first thing. Now, we all know that life comes from life. It's the situation everywhere and throughout all time. New life comes from existing life. It never comes from non-life. And incidentally, some time ago, more than 100 years ago, people did believe that some life arose spontaneously. I think this was at the time of Louis Pasteur, who was, amongst other things, I think it was him who disproved that. But when one more careful observation in a scientific way, it was found that actually this life, which appeared to be spontaneously created out of the earth, actually came from pre-existing life. And so I think we know pretty clearly these days, with all the observation that's gone on, that life comes from life and not from non-life. And it's the same for elephants and humans. It's the same for jellyfish and germs and every species of life. So that every living thing that you've ever seen is evidence of that fact. So mostly we don't readily think of that as evidence because it is just so commonplace. But every day, every hour of every day, every moment of every hour, there are literally the addition of evidence. There's trillions of new evidences there to support that fact that life comes from life. And on the other hand, the evidence for the proposition that life comes from non-life is absolutely zero. So there's abundant evidence for the fact that life comes from life. And given the fact that the widespread understanding these days is that is about the Big Bang, which is not a subject I want to go into now, but it has been the subject of previous addresses of reasonable faith. It seems that everything originally came out of something very, very simple, this Big Bang. At that point, there was no life as we know it, no animal life. So if life always comes from life, where did that life come from? It must at some stage have been created. And the implication of this, as I've said then, is that living things have actually been created. And that implies a creator, namely God. Furthermore, we know that for each and every species of living things, individuals of that species reproduce individuals of that same species. It's the situation everywhere and throughout all time. Individuals of a particular species came from individuals of that same species, never from other species. And it's the same for cats and human beings, for penguins and flies and everything else. Every living thing you've ever seen is evidence of that, is evidence in support of that proposition that a particular species gives birth to or generates that same species and not another species. So once again, the evidence for that is absolutely astronomical in scale. Every day, every hour, every moment of time, there are trillions of additional pieces of evidence to support that proposition that life in a species comes from former life in that species and not from another species. The evidence for the alternative, that one species came from another species, actually is zero. There is zero evidence for that. So the implication of this is that every species of living thing has actually been created. And that implies a creator, namely God. Now let's consider sexual and asexual reproduction before I get into the substance of this book. Sexual reproduction is vastly more complicated than asexual reproduction. In the case of asexual reproduction, an individual simply eats and grows, and at a certain point, when it's grown sufficiently and there's sufficient food available in its environment and there's no threat perceived to it, it simply divides. It feels safe. It simply divides into two or more new individuals. And that's very simple, relatively speaking. And there's no need for reference to any other individual. But in the case of sexual reproduction, a male of a particular species must grow to sexual maturity, must find a female of that same species, make sure it's of that same species, must find one that is sexually mature, and must convince that female or entice her or overpower her in order to mate. Oh, it's vastly more complicated. Then the process of sexual fertilization too is just so amazing, and I'm not going to go further into that tonight. But if we didn't already know about it and weren't so aware of it happening all around us, then the actual process of the male element finding the female element and bonding with it would just seem so improbable as to be unbelievable. It's an everyday miracle. So how did sexual reproduction ever arise? Asexual reproduction is actually very efficient and it's simple. And there are tens of thousands of species in existence today, flourishing, that successfully utilize that method of reproduction. However, would the simpler method of reproduction evolve into the astonishingly complicated method of sexual reproduction? Now, I do understand that species that utilize sexual reproduction are able to adapt to a changing environment better than the species that utilize asexual reproduction. That may be true. But that doesn't answer the question, how would the simpler asexual reproduction develop or evolve into sexual reproduction? And it would seem to be an impossible step that cannot be explained despite many attempts. The implication of this is that sexual reproduction itself was designed and created. And that implies a designer and creator, namely God. Now let's consider more closely sexual reproduction. What drives sexual attraction, which leads to sexual reproduction? We know that unless there's reproduction, the species will become extinct. So the biological purpose of sex is the survival of the species. But there's something quite odd here, because the survival of the species is a very different matter, a very different issue from the survival of the individual. We find it easy to understand what's driving things to make an individual survive, why an individual wants to survive and what that needs to do in order to survive. But the survival of the species and the sex drive which is behind that may actually be in opposition to the thrust for the survival of the individual. And I'll need to expand a little on this. When we stop eating for a while, we experience hunger. There's an urge there to get food and to take in food. And the urge to eat is very obviously there so that the individual will continue to live. There's a great desire to survive, to continue to live. So when we're short of food, we have this hunger to drive us to get food and to eat. That's very easy to understand. Stop eating eventually and you'll die. Now, it's like that too with the urge to drink, the urge to breathe, the urge to be at the right temperature, and many other things. There's all these urges within all of us as human beings, and in varying degrees in all the other animal creation, to aid that individual to survive and make sure it continues to live. But the urge to have sex is not like that. It's something rather different, because the individual will survive whether or not they ever experience sex. And in some cases, perhaps many cases, perhaps even the majority, the urge to have sex may actually be detrimental to the individual's health and life. There's some very obvious examples of that. They go everything from the lion and the elk to the spiders and bees. And I will cover a little bit of this later on. With some species, as we know, the competition between males for the rights of access to females for the purpose of mating is intense. Some fight to death and some others almost so. It's exhausting and it's dangerous. Wouldn't the individual male be far better off forgetting about sex and just concentrating on its own personal survival, on looking for food and water, for making itself comfortable and secure from predators, and not worrying about sex? You can see there the difference between the need for the species to survive and the need for the individual to survive. And what about the female? After fertilization, she becomes more vulnerable than she was before. She's more vulnerable to predators and to losing out in the competition to get food, etc., and whatever she needs for her own personal survival, because she's bearing this young one and devoting energy to that. And furthermore, she needs more food than she needed before, because the unborn offspring is growing off of her supplies, generally. Why would she want to bear the young? It's an additional risk. Then, after the young arrive, the adults, one or other or both of them generally, are engaged in feeding that young one, defending and protecting it, keeping it warm and comfortable and so on. And all these things can very well detract from their own personal safety and well-being. So, what drives sex? It's not needed for the survival of the individual, and in fact may be detrimental to that. It's needed for the survival of the species, so that life will continue and the life of that species will continue on Earth. The implication here is that it's been designed for a purpose, and that implies there's a designer, namely God. He's designed sexual reproduction to be as it is so that species will survive. I know some people might say, well, what I'm talking about here when I'm mentioning God is a God of the gaps. You know, some aspect that we don't know at the moment. I've just invoked God to cover that gap, and eventually science will be able to explain that gap. But there's actually something wrong with that argument. There's something vital missing. We may very well be able to explain how sex works in terms of mechanics, in terms of hormones, chemistry, electrical signals that give pleasure, and so on. And as time goes on, we'll probably be able to explain these things in more and more fine detail in every case, not only for human beings, but for all other species as well, as we investigate these things. We may be able to explain how in immense detail, but science does not and cannot explain why. But we can see, it seems quite clear that there's purpose in all these things. Okay, well, with all that preamble, I now want to get into this, this book and consider some of the things in wild sex, okay? Now, there's a lot of stuff in this book. It's in 3 main sections. It covers all the ways in which the male generally seeks to attract or engage the female. And it talks about the use of colour, the use of sounds, like birdsong, for example. It talks about scents and aromas. It talks about dance and ritual performances, all these kind of things, all these things involved. And the author's gone to quite some extent in classifying these things and comparing one species with another, and many interesting things here. The 3rd section of her book is entitled Mating Styles, and it's this that I want to look at in particular. Now, there's actually an amazing variety of styles amongst wild animals. It's greater than I had previously imagined. And with some species, we find there's a single male and a single female that remain sexual partners for life and ignore all others. And I'm just going to quote here, first quote from Windy Bank's book, page 199. She writes here about monogamy. And she says, among those mammals thought to be monogamous are the following: gibbons, gorillas, orangutans, beavers, the hooded seal, badgers, foxes, and mongooses. Then there are others that lead quasi-monogamous lifestyle. They include the roe deer, hyraxes, and rhinoceroses. Sometimes animals are together they have this monogamous relationship for a season. Sometimes it's for life. Surprisingly, termites too are monogamous. How about that? Now, she writes just around here that actually, though there are examples of monogamy, polygamy is far more widespread in the natural world than one-on-one style partnerships. And we're not surprised at that either. Monogamy is more common amongst birds than amongst mammals. The monogamous birds include the following: grey geese, storks, albatrosses, penguins, jackdaws, parrots, parakeets, pigeons, doves, partridges, vultures, hawks, falcons, and eagles. Though there is some doubt in certain cases. Excuse me. Maybe it lasts for a season, maybe it lasts for life. Winterbank claims that even in species where monogamy is the norm, there are occasional instances of homosexual relationships, without offspring, of course, and a ménage à trois, or a threesome relationship. Now, incidentally, human beings are almost alone, not quite alone, but almost alone amongst the species in having the ability to enjoy sex at any time of the year. But surprisingly, rats, mice, rabbits, and flies also have this ability. Nearly all other species are limited to specific seasons, generally related to the weather, to the season of the year, but it's more limited than with human beings. Also, human beings are almost alone in mating face to face. Surprisingly, whales do too, and so do hamsters, beavers, and two-toed sloths. How about that? And in human beings, the mammary glands used for suckling infants are close to the face, in our case, different from almost all other mammals. So in respect to these features that I've mentioned, we seem to be set apart from almost all other animals. And if you consider those three things together, we are on our own. Now, in contrast to monogamy, there's promiscuity. This is widespread in the world of wildlife, and there's many examples of casual sex encounters, polygamy, and group sex. We're all familiar, I expect, with domestic dogs and cats. Consider dogs first. Dogs have a highly developed sense of smell, and when one dog encounters another, a high priority in that encounter is for it to sniff one another's scent glands. And the prime purpose of that is to determine whether the other dog is female and if she's in heat, if she's in estrus, if she's sexually receptive and fertile. And when she is on heat, she emits a special sex scent. This scent can waft a long way and attract males from far and wide, each of which shows a keen desire to mate with the female. One or more get lucky, and then they buzz off and leave the female with the fertilised ovum inside her. Now, cats behave similarly. Female cats on heat not only emit a sex scent, but they also cry wildly to advertise their presence. People who own domestic dogs and cats in particular will be familiar with these things, but I think we're all familiar with these things really. Tomcats, the males, howl and release a strong sex scent in their urine during mating season that they gladly spray on objects all over the place. Once again, males can be attracted from near and far as they seek the female. A casual sex encounter with one or more males ensues, who then tick off. Now, we might draw an implication at this point. The implication seems to be that when human beings behave this way, well, it's only natural. Men are attracted to a sexy woman, however we define that, and they seek to have intercourse with her before moving on to other desirable women. There's no reason to be disapproving of such conduct any more than in the case of cats and dogs. It's just natural. Hey, but just wait a minute. I think we should hold off on drawing an implication at this stage, and we need to consider a little bit more of the natural world, and then we can make some implications. We haven't actually taken enough facts into account yet. We've only just looked at domestic dogs and cats. Let's look further. Adult tigers, both male and female, lead solitary lives, mainly. They come together briefly in mating season, and the female is left to bear and raise the cubs largely or entirely on her own until the cubs reach maturity. Another example of casual sex encounter is the sage grouse. And I'll quote here from page 181 of Wendy Banks' book. These examples she has cover the whole realm of the animal world, from not just mammals or not just birds, includes fish and everything down to the smallest creatures, worms and insects and everything. It's quite fascinating. Anyway, I was going to talk about the sage grouse. For 3 months, the males strut around flaunting their brilliant plumage and securing the tiny pieces of ground upon which they will copulate. Then on only one night, flocks of hens descend and begin to look for a sex partner. They are immediately attracted to the most colourful male with the finest piece of real estate, and they converge on him. There are usually only about 5 of these superb specimens available, and since time is of the essence, they begin copulating straight away without any foreplay. The males continue this down the waiting line, taking a breather every now and then to recover their strength. When they are exhausted, going from one female to the next and to the next, and can perform no more, then the lesser males sneak in and service the unsated females, just waiting patiently for their turn. Okay, so that's the sage grouse. Another example is the Uganda cob, which is a type of antelope, which behaves similarly. The male servicing one female after another in quick succession until the male is exhausted, and as he steps aside, another eager male quickly takes his place. That's also all natural. Then there's polygamy. We've got examples that we'd be familiar with, I think, of deer, cattle, sheep, goats, bison, and lions. With the hoofed animals, one male may have a harem of up to 50 females. They stick together for a long time, and the alpha male may be with a few lesser males, but it's generally the alpha male. He certainly has priority. He protects the females and their offspring and also services them all regularly. But very often, before the herd is established, there's intense fighting amongst rival males, which may well result in serious injury or death. The alpha male also maintains his position generally for only a single season before he's knocked off by some rival who takes his place. All this is just natural sexual behaviour. And then there's group sex. This is where sexual activity is stimulated at a certain time amongst a gathering of a large number of individuals. And in this category, there's some bizarre behaviour. And I'm going to tell you of the mud snails, which is on page 170 of Winterbank's book. When mud snails have sex, they form the original love train. About half a dozen snails line up in a row and copulate simultaneously. At the beginning of the breeding season, the first snail in the chain acts as a female. The next snail in line acts as a male to the first female, but when joined by the third snail, it also acts as a female. Thus, all snails from second to fifth position in the chain have a dual sexual role. The last and sixth snail acts only as a male. Once the six have sorted out their respective roles, they fall into formation and lock together, acting as a single entity. And they all get fertilised. Now, I need to bring to your attention here that all known species of land snails are hermaphrodites. That is, they've each got a full set of both male and female organs within the one body. And then there's so that we're not just not thinking that, well, snails are very far from us. Let's consider monkeys, I hope I get this pronunciation right, the Callicebus monkeys that Wendy Banks tells us of, what they do. And they're from Colombia. They are unusual in that they do mate for life and settle down with their lifelong partner on a small piece of territory that is ferociously guarded. The line between territories is clearly marked, and if another monkey steps over the line, he is immediately chased off what is private property. In this way, the life of these monkeys becomes a series of feuds with their neighbours, and these have formed the basis of their social relationships. Partners are guarded just as closely as territory, and opportunities for extramarital affairs are few and far between. However, at a certain time every year, the female Callicebus monkeys come into estrus, and it is then on for young and old. All boundary disputes and quarrels between neighbours are forgotten as the entire population throws itself headfirst into a period of unrivaled sexual activity. Fidelity becomes a thing of the past, and for the duration of estrus, the whole community revels in the throes of a wild and frenzied sexual orgy. Then, after a few days, when the period of estrus ends, these couples lose that loving feeling and abruptly revert to their old ways. Territories are reformed and the walls go up again until the same time the following year when they can all let their hair down again. Quite amazing, isn't it? But it's all completely natural. It's natural for the Callicebus monkeys anyway. Okay, we're beginning to appreciate, just from those few examples, what a great variety of sexual activity there is. And there's much, much more in this book. The chapter headings of the book, Wild Sex, will give some idea of further aspects of the mating game, as the author has kind of categorised things. And she has chapter headings which include the following: rape, really common enough; incest; sadomasochism, that is the infliction of pain associated with the sex act in order to heighten sexual feeling in one or both, sexual receptivity, or even to stimulate the fertilisation. There's bondage, which means binding the female for the purpose of sex and keeping her bound, maybe for some time. This is related to the harem idea of the deer that I mentioned earlier, but it's a little bit further than that. There's also a chapter on virgin birth and homosexuality, polyandry, fatal love, transvestitism, and other things. Now, I'll just mention a few of the species that are listed here about different examples. Examples of rape include the wolf spider, certain frogs, finches, ducks, North American mink, crocodile, and grey seal. The example given of incest is the moth mite. Examples of sadomasochism include the following: wild horse, domestic cat, turtle, Roman snail, common slug, cephalopods, which is the whole gamut of species covering squid, cuttlefish, and octopus. There's the river crayfish and lizard. Examples of bondage include the water mite, the damselfly, soldier crab, certain spiders, the African clawed frog, bullhead fish, tizid beetle, I hope I've got that pronunciation right, and the millipede. The subject is really vast, but I want to move on to one specific part, that is the instances of fatal love. Windy Banks writes on pages 261 and 262, fatal love means sex that ends in death for one party at least, and it's the male. Let's read this bit here. There's many examples of animals in the wild where the females have sex with a mate and then calmly eat him afterwards. This cannibalistic approach to love seems repulsive to humans, but as we have seen, there is always a reason in the natural world for even the most horrific behaviour. So she gives a reason why it's so. Often the impetus behind eating a partner after sexual intimacy is because of a condition known as protein hunger. After the male has performed his function, that is, fertilising the female, he becomes superfluous in many species, and it's argued, well, he'd die soon anyway. Instead of wasting the wonderful nutrients in his body, the female eats him. Thus, he acts as both father and food for the future offspring. The most famous example of sexual cannibalism is the praying mantis. During the mating season, the male approaches the female with a spermatophore. This is a bit of a variation on reproduction as it occurs amongst humans. A spermatophore is like a little sac containing the sperm, and they're all held there, and he hands it on to the female. He approaches the female with a spermatophore, and the larger female throws her lethal arms around the male and accepts its placement in her sexual opening. She then turns around and falls on her lover and begins munching him for an after-sex snack. Sometimes the male has not even finalised, he hasn't even finished copulating before she begins nibbling away at him. Fortunately, his sex drive is so strong, he's able to continue even while being slowly eaten away. The female's ravenous appetite is the subject of some considerable controversy, although most observers agree that she does eat the male on many occasions. and it is a matter of debate apparently. But about a lot of other species, there is absolutely no room for doubt. And she lists a whole lot. She lists, besides the praying mantis, there's the scorpion, the wheelweb spider, the antlion, golden ground beetles, and even the honeybee, surprisingly. I won't quote all this now, but in the bee society, which is a very complex and large society, you have the male bees. They're ready to fertilise the virgin queen when she's going off to another colony. She only needs to be fertilised once, and happens in the air, on the wing. And there's about 200 of the male drone bees which will follow her because she emits a scent. So they're following her. They're all anxious to unite with her. There's only one lucky one who does. And when he does, in midair, just for a few seconds, when he's finished fertilising her, she's got enough sperm that she needs within her for the rest of life. For all the bees that she'll produce thereafter, they remain within her body as she produces more and more eggs, and they've fertilised internally in her. So the male fertilises her that once, and then when he's finished, his penis actually snaps off, and he falls to the ground and bleeds to death. That's the end of him. He's done his job. And all the other males that we're following, they don't get a smell in then. They're just simply left to starve to death. They're not needed. Nobody's going to feed them. They're not needed in the colony. That's it. They're gone. Okay, that's the honeybee. Well, there's plenty more in this book, Wild Sex, but I think I've told you enough now. But there are two more observations from the natural world that I want to just bring to your attention. One is in the book and the other's not. But in this case, I want to just quote from Wikipedia. The first concerns bears, a whole range of bears, including polar bears and brown bears. And here I'm quoting from the Wikipedia article, Brown Bear. Brown bears practice infanticide, as an adult male bear may kill the cubs of a female bear. When an adult male brown bear kills a cub, it is usually, this is what's the reason put onto this, it is usually because he's trying to bring the female into estrus, and she will enter that state within 2 to 4 days after the death of her cubs. They won't be his cubs in any case. There's some previous male encounter. So she's got cubs that are dependent on her, and she's trying to protect them. He kills those cubs before he has sexual intercourse with the female brown bear. Cubs flee up a tree if available. When they see a strange male bear, and the mother, the mother often successfully defends them, even though the male be twice as heavy as she and stronger. Although females have been known to lose their lives in these confrontations. Now, this is the way bears live: polar bears, brown bears, and other bears. This is natural behaviour for them. The second concerns some species of cuckoos, birds. And here, when we think about this and relate it to human life, we do find this pretty abhorrent too, just as abhorrent as we do about the behaviour of the bears. About 56, and I'm quoting here from the Wikipedia article on cuckoos, about 56 of the Old World species and 3 of the New World species are what's called brood parasites. Laying their eggs in the nests of other species, they only reproduce in this fashion. The cuckoo egg hatches earlier than the host's. The cuckoo chick grows faster. In most cases, the chick evicts the eggs or young of the host species. They simply die. The chick encourages the host to keep pace with its high growth rate, with its rapid begging call, and the chick's open mouth, which serves as a sign stimulus. So there's a lot more can be said about cuckoos. I have read too that the male cuckoo is involved in this process too. It's an action they do together. The male distracts the other female bird from her nest for a time. It either threatens her or attracts her out of the nest somehow. While she's off her nest, the female cuckoo jumps in, lays her egg. She's a very quick layer, and she can lay eggs that look like those of the species that are targeted. When the other female bird comes back to the nest, she may even recognise that that's a foreign egg and tries to dislodge it, but she's not able to. So if she wants to keep her own eggs warm and bring them to the point of hatching, she can't do anything but bring this other one to maturity as well. So the cuckoo birds don't spend any time building a nest or having to feed their young or anything, but they just rely on other species to do this at the expense of their own progeny. Okay, now that completes the survey of the amazing variety of wild sex that I want to just bring to you tonight. Before I draw some implications, I want to make a couple of comments about Susan Windybank's book. Could you turn that off, please, love? First one is this. Throughout her book, she describes animal behaviour in human terms and applies human judgments or feelings, and often with humour. Funnily, at one point, she says, oh, the Victorians used to do this, and, they describe the birds that are monogamous, for example, and caring for the young in glowing terms, and be very down on birds that were more promiscuous. And she writes disparagingly of the Victorian era, but funnily, she does this same thing herself throughout the book, describes all these situations in human terms. It's just that her particular approach is a modernist, feminist approach, but she has a lot of interesting comments about these things. I actually think that this is acceptable, what she's doing here. It's unscientific, of course, but it is acceptable. After all, this is a populist presentation, and her style makes all the facts easier to understand. Now, I could illustrate this, but I think I'll just forego this at this stage. But throughout it all, it's through the eyes of a human being imagining that this is an equivalent human situation, and bringing all our own thoughts and judgments into that. And the second thing about the book, which is more negative, is that she assumes evolution throughout, from start to finish. The evolution of life from non-life, evolution of sexual processes, evolution of every species from other species. And there's no proof of this presented in her book anywhere, on any page. And in fact, there's no proof anywhere else either, for that matter. It's simply an assumption. It's unwarranted, and it's unscientific, and it's disappointing. But unfortunately, it's the shibboleth of our modern age, that people think they just have to assume evolution for everything. And it's just not necessary. It's not scientific. No, okay, now let me draw some further implications from what we've considered so far. The variety of sexual behaviour amongst all the wildlife on planet Earth is absolutely amazing. But each species behaves in strict accordance with what is normal for that particular species. It doesn't deviate from that. There's no change, there's no variation, there's no progression. Each species behaves in certain specific ways. Secondly, nothing that any animal does is wrong or immoral. It's just what they do. They always act in accordance with their own nature, their own instincts. And those instincts that may be from may be there from the beginning, from genetics. Certain things are learned from their own experience, the experience of life in the colony, if they're amongst a lot of others, from their parents or whatever. But nonetheless, it is their instincts, and they behave in accordance with those instincts always. They don't deviate from that. Morality amongst animals doesn't exist. It's just what they do. Now, the third thing, and this is important, I think, we cannot determine what is acceptable sexual behaviour amongst human beings by looking at animals. We've seen a huge variety, and while we might think, well, we see certain instances of animal behaviour that we think, well, that would be okay if human beings did that, and maybe we could draw boundaries, different people would draw different boundaries, but we consider animals and we say, yeah, well, that, that we think that's natural, and human beings can behave that way, and that's okay. But there are a huge number of other examples of animal behaviour in relation to sex that are repugnant to us or intolerable to us, and we find it disgusting and terrible. But it's okay for animals. Human beings, in fact, we know this, have a moral sense and a conscience. Every one of us actually do make judgments all the time about what is right or wrong in relation to sexual behaviour. We might think, oh, we don't, because we're tolerant of a range of things. But yes, if you considered all the range of things that are there in the animal world, we all do make judgments about those things as to what is acceptable and not acceptable in amongst human beings. We make judgments, and we do it all the time, actually, and we judge others and we judge ourselves too as to what is right and what is wrong. Now look, let me give you some illustrations of this. No one thinks that because a male polar bear kills the cubs that are not his own, mates with their mother, and then leaves her pregnant and buzzes off, no one thinks that, well, since that's what bears do, that's okay for humans to do that. Nobody thinks that. If it did happen amongst human beings, we would regard that as a horrific crime, and it would be sensational. It would be something absolutely terrible. And I think we would all agree about this. This has nothing to do with race or religion or anything else that distinguishes one group of beings from another. I think this would be universal. We would think that that kind of behaviour in human beings is just simply a terrible crime. No one thinks that it's okay for a male human being to imprison females against their will for the purpose of having sex. Now, such things have occasionally happened. I can remember one instance of in America, of course, where this happened. But also there was another one in Germany, and from time to time there are such things of females being captured and imprisoned, and there's a great hunt for this missing female, but it turns out that the female was imprisoned, or maybe more than one, and it's for the purpose of this deviant male having sex. And when such things do happen, we don't just say, oh, well, that's just natural, that's okay. No, it becomes sensational worldwide news, and there's widespread outrage about such things happening. And no one thinks that, well, because female spiders, which are generally, amongst spiders, females are generally larger and stronger and have a more poison in their glands than males do. But nobody thinks that, well, because female spiders kill and eat their male partner immediately after sex, nobody thinks that, well, such behaviour is acceptable amongst human beings. It would be quite shocking and bizarre. So I think we conclude from this that human beings have a moral sense, a conscience about these matters, that animals have no such moral sense or conscience. They just do what's in accordance with their instincts, with what's in accordance with their nature. So human beings are unique in this respect amongst all the animals. We're different from all the other animals. Where did this come from? How come? Every human being has got this within them. It obviously did not come from the animals. The implication is that human beings are different. We're radically different from all other animals. We're set apart. We're actually consecrated. That word consecrated means set apart for a particular purpose. And we can see that we are different from all the others. Why are we different? What for? And who did this? These really need careful consideration. And the implication is that this internal law that we have within us, this ability to judge, and this irrepressible and ever-present need to judge was actually put there by the lawgiver. the judge, namely God. God has done this because he has a special purpose for human beings in being set apart from all the other animals. And we're set apart from them in many other ways too, but I wanted to just consider tonight all the things, the implications that arise out of considering sexual conduct. I believe that this is part of what it means that we are made in God's image, in fact, unlike all the other animals. It's an essential part, it's an important part of our existence. We can learn much, very much, from careful observation of wildlife, including considering wild sex. But we can only get so far in considering those things. To go further than that, we actually need a revelation. I'm going to leave it there because that's another subject altogether. But I hope you found the information I presented stimulating and have considered the implications from what we've been reading about, what we've learned about this subject too. So thank you very much, everyone, for your attention. Over to you, Kevin.
Yeah, I better unmute myself. Thank you very much, Geoff, for your talk, and everybody, you can feel free to unmute yourselves as well. Right, we've you sharing your screen again, Geoff, are you?
Oh yeah, well, we're going to have a discussion now, are we?
Yeah, but you might as well leave we don't really need that slide on.
Okay.
You can stop sharing it so we can actually see each other better.
Okay, there you go.
All right, thank you. I whacked a whole pile of comments in the chat, but we don't have to stick with me. So would anybody like to actually follow up some of the comments that they've actually put in the chat line?
Well, I haven't read these, of course, because I've been occupied with what I've been doing.
All right, well, I'll kick off. At the moment, you said design is implied. Now, what was the trigger that you said that design was implied?
This was because all animals have the ability to reproduce, but reproduction is not actually essential for the individual to survive. So it would seem that the ability to reproduce in one way or another is there for a purpose. And of course, it's clear to see that purpose is the survival of the species. The survival of the species is a very different matter from survival of the individual. So it seemed where there's purpose there, it implies that there's design, and somebody must have done that. Now, incidentally, this is another interesting feature about Windibank's book, because on the one hand, she wants to say all the time, yes, it's all just evolution and isn't that clever and everything. But she can constantly, on every page, she uses words that imply intention, that imply making a choice, that imply that there's a goal, there's something that's driving this change from one, when she's comparing one species with another and similar behaviour, there's a reason. She wants to tell you there's reasons why it's gone from this to that, because it's better fitting them for something. So all along, all through her book, and a lot of evolutionists do this, they cannot get away from using words that imply design and purpose and intention. But on the other hand, they want to say, well, it's all just completely chance, just blind chance, random events, and then there's the survival of the fittest, and so something comes out of this. It doesn't go with all these words. They would say nature isn't, nature's purpose in this is blah, blah, blah. Evolution's intention here is that, this and that. Well, nature of itself doesn't have a purpose. Evolution can't have an intention. It's all supposedly just chance, random events. It doesn't gel right. But a person like this author cannot get away from using words all the time that imply intention and purpose and design. And those things all actually mean there is a designer. There is someone who's done something. If there is an intention, if there's a purpose, there's somebody's doing that.
Well, I can understand people not accepting your argument because because every individual dies, so you're going to die anyway. So if you're just trying to prevent your own death, but you never reproduce, that would be no good for the species, and the species would die out.
Why does the individual care about the survival of the species? The individual cares about the survival of the individual.
But the individual may not care about the survival of the species. But the fact of the matter is, if there wasn't reproduction, then the species would die out. So it's a natural selection effect. So the only species that will survive is those that reproduce.
Yeah, but what's driving that? There's no driver for it. The individual cares about survival of the individual. The individual, look, you'll see this all the time. None of those animals are thinking about, well, we must make sure the species continue. No,
is care and instinct the same thing?
Pardon?
Yeah, nobody may care. The fact is, you wouldn't observe a species prolonging unless that happened.
No, but there's that urge must have been put there because it does not relate to survival of the individual.
Yeah, but the urges exist because the species survives.
Yeah, but the individual does not care. No individual cares about the survival of the species. They only care about satisfying their own urges. Mm. So it implies there's a design, there's an intention there, and we can see what that is. It is that this species will survive, but it doesn't gel with the evolutionist idea about the need for survival, because they mix up survival of the individual with survival of the species.
I was just having a look at Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. I notice he doesn't like the term blind chance. He prefers the idea of randomness, which is different than blind chance, because blind chance assumes that there's nothing, no force or power behind it. It's just almost like magic in a sense, blind chance. He prefers randomness, so there is natural forces behind what happens. And it's the mutations, the variations that produce change, and that's what he's basically arguing in this book here, which I just got it out of my little library behind me. I should say in front of me.
There's plenty of evidence for variation within a species, but there's no evidence for variation that changes one species to another. There's no evidence for that.
I think that's a fairly debatable topic. I mean, in itself, evolutionists claim that there's numerous examples of fossil records which suggest mutation from one species to another. I know that's a very hotly contested issue. I agree.
Fossil records are evidence that there was this species and there was that species. It does not show that one species came from another species. How can it show that?
On the issue of zero evidence doesn't necessarily mean something can't happen, because many individuals have died without leaving any trace behind, but they still existed, even though we have no evidence for them. So, do
you have any evidence for that?
I think you're being facetious, Brian. But so in principle, just because there's no evidence for something doesn't necessarily mean it never happened.
I agree with that.
It may just simply be that we just don't know.
That's right, yeah.
But at the point I was talking about, the amount of evidence for things, it's generally not considered evidence, the fact that, well, life comes from life, because it's just a commonplace for us. It's just there all the time. But actually, every instance of a life producing a new life is a piece of evidence in this matter, and it supports the proposition that life comes from life. Now, where's the evidence that life comes from no life?
Sorry, can I butt in there, please? Yeah, I've just put something on there. Certainly, the creation magazines have to defend against the Miller-Urey experiment back in '52, where they were able to synthesize amino acids, which the simplest proteins have got 40 amino acids. So certainly, you'll find the the biologists who support creation, life forming from inanimate objects, and they've got the experiment there behind them. Now, it's I've actually put a link in there, you can read about it in Wikipedia. There are some arguments against it. One is when you ever create amino acids in the natural sense by doing this experiment, you'll get an even number of left-hand and right-handed amino acids. And the one thing that's very hard, and they're still struggling to show how, is that life on Earth has a signature that's only made, the proteins are only made from left-handed amino acids. But if you look into it, you'll find, they're arguing about under certain conditions, you might be able to just imagine how something was influencing so that only the left-handed amino acids somehow came together to make the proteins. But there is quite a theory as to how life generated from non-life forms.
Yeah, I know.
There's a meteor that fell in Victoria, of all places, and I think you'll find it in that link, which shows that that amino had something like 20 or 30 amino acids in it. And, of course, the evolutionists said, oh, there you go. It was formed from outer space. There you go. There's the amino acids, the building blocks for life, for proteins. So, no, there's quite many scientists who want to say that we come from a material universe only. That'll point to that means as how life originated from non-life forms.
Yeah, actually, I've only read just recently about that experiment and some others like that, but there's quite a few things to say about that. And one is that amino acids are still a million miles from having, from a single self-replicating living thing. They might be the building blocks of life. It might be fair to say that, or the building blocks for proteins, which are then the building blocks for life. But it's a million miles still from actually creating life. Now, another criticism of this experiment and others like it is that they actually started with organic materials that came from living things. They broke them down, and then they are able to rejoin some of them together and say, well, look, we've created this. But they didn't actually start from elemental substances. They're not starting from. They're actually starting. I think I don't know whether it's that particular experiment or others like that. They've actually started from material that's come from living beings. It's not itself living.
Well, I hear what you say, but there's this meteorite which came from outer space with the amino acids. So and look, the planet Titan, is it, of Saturn, there certainly has got mixtures of ethane and methane in it. Certainly there are organic compounds out there. Even Mars has methane coming out of it, which they say, oh, it must be life forms. But no, there are organic compounds out there in the universe, and including amino acids in this meteorite that fell to Earth.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an argument we have to fight.
A million miles from actually creating life. I mean, in the sensational press, and it's often presented that way, scientists have just about created life, or they have created life in a laboratory. But actually, when you look into it, they really haven't.
No, fully agree. But I'm just saying there is at least a lot of scientists still working on how it could have happened, and they will point out that experiment. And indeed, if you read that link, even the conditions on Earth apparently now are different from the one they used. But they say, oh, well, we can show you can create another way. So they're certainly working on trying to make that point. Yeah,
and they have been for decades, and there's a great deal of intelligence gone into those creating those conditions and everything in this laboratory condition. And it's very debatable whether it does replicate the condition of a primitive Earth.
But as I say, to just say, oh, there's no way that inanimate life, I mean, I'm sorry, but you will run up against the people that immediately say, well, look at all these amino acids that can happen.
Geoff, you seem to be saying two things. One, you're saying that sexual behaviour cannot occur naturally. It must have some sort of origin, external origin. And the other you're saying is you can't actually take animal behaviour and then apply it to humans because it's so variant. Humans experience moral judgments in terms of sexual behaviour, and so those moral judgments must actually come externally.
Yep.
So those are your two things you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, yeah, I'm correct.
Right, okay.
And there's been attempts, of course, because evolutionists, evolution biologists are driven to this. They must find an explanation for, number one, how did life come from non-life? And they've still not been, despite, you know, decades and much money spent on this, they've still not been able to come up with a plausible explanation, certainly not been able to demonstrate. And the other thing is, well, how did sex arise, sexual reproduction? And again, there's been ideas bandied forth, but nobody's ever proposed, ever put forward a satisfactory explanation for how on earth could it have actually arisen. It's one thing for cells to divide. It's another thing for sexual reproduction as against asexual reproduction. And there's been numerous attempts, but it's actually, those that are more candid will admit that it's baffling.
Yeah, and I think people will argue that anything that has behaviours can occur by chance, many of them are non-adaptive, but if they have characteristics that cause the species to flourish, then that will be the cause. And so on that, that's on your first argument. And on the second, because humans have intelligence, they also have empathy. And so that would be a cause for deducing morals.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what people are going to be arguing, but whether they're right or wrong, but I could understand them not being convinced.
Humans have two sides. They can be extremely brutal and cruel, as well as kind and compassion. It's not all one way.
No.
I feel like animals can also be loving to other animals rather than that just being for their own gain.
I get the impression my dog loves me.
Well, I think dogs is probably my example of where.
That's because they're soulish animals. They've got emotions.
I'm not sure I'd trust a lion to love me.
No.
If we're talking about empathy, we then have to ask, where does empathy come from?
Well, just empathy is kind of a consciousness of understanding what the other person's thinking and not just seeing things from your point of view.
So it's not just a chemical reaction in the brain?
I'm not seeking to try produce a cause for it, but it is part of human intelligence. We actually have the ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes and then kind of see things from other people's point of view.
Although great evil also comes from intelligence.
Yeah. Yeah, well, some people might seek to exploit that. So if you're selling cars, you probably see things from the other person's point of view and appeal to that, so you can sell a car.
Is it proven that animals don't have empathy?
Well, they don't sell cars.
That one.
Thanks for that, Brian.
But then their animals seem to have some empathy within their tribe, but outside of it, it's very little.
Anyway, what do the rest of you think of Geoff's argument?
I think it's got a lot of merit. At the beginning, Geoff, you said, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, at the beginning, you mentioned something about it's not necessary for life on Earth to exist. If it didn't exist, something like that, if it didn't exist, then the Earth would go on. Is that what you said? something
That's
like that.
right. Not as we know it, but the Earth as such would go on just like the Moon and the other planets. They don't have life, as far as we know. They don't have life on them, but they exist. So there's nothing necessary for. It's not necessary that there be life on Earth for the Earth to exist. Yeah.
No, but it's necessary for life to exist on Earth for us to exist.
That's correct.
Yeah. So I would argue that if we didn't have life, like even bacterial life or simple cellular life, and even more complex life, then we wouldn't exist. So it's like building up to a crescendo, and we are it. Yeah.
Yeah. We know that all life is connected, isn't it? Even there's a big concern at the moment about the virus, this coronavirus, for example. But actually, it was what I read from not William Lane Craig, the other guy that we had heard from just recently, the American fellow, Hugh Ross.
Yeah.
I've read from him that, well, viruses are actually essential. If viruses didn't exist, then the whole world would become a slime pit of bacterial slime pit. And the viruses are necessary to keep bacteria in check. And everything's necessary. And the more we know about all this, life is really integrated. The predators keep in check all these other things that are just multiply out of all proportion otherwise. That one thing needs another thing all the way through.
That's right, yeah.
I think that's what ecology is all about.
Yeah, in fact, I've got a quote from his book here, Improbable Planet. He says, the different kinds of purely physical life forms and those possessing both physical and non-physical attributes explains the observed hierarchy in Earth's physical and biological features. Unicellular life can thrive without the existence of more complex life. However, multicellular organisms cannot exist without unicellular organisms. Multicellular life also requires a more highly fine-tuned physical environment than unicellular life. Yeah. And actually in another book, I'm not sure which one it is, he goes on to talk about how in evolutionary theory, modern conservationists have observed that a species will go extinct before it can evolve if it's any more than, I think it's 3 kilograms, but it might be less. So if you apply that theory, or that evidence that they've said that a species will go extinct, and our world is just full of species going extinct before they've managed to evolve and change, all right, then how did anything evolve if the world as we would have been changing, a species over 3 kilograms, like you're talking small mammals, they would go extinct before they could change when the climate changed or the environment changed for them. So how could evolution have occurred?
A lot of people believe that it didn't.
Yeah, I don't believe
Babe,
it.
sorry.
A lot of people believe that evolution did not occur, that it could not have occurred.
Yeah, well, that's unfortunately people. The irony of it is, amongst like colleagues or whatever, it's like because we grew up with reading textbooks that said evolution occurred, right? They've all just, and then you don't read about it anymore or find out about it anymore. Everyone walks around going, "Oh, it's already a done deal," but they actually don't realise there's everyone questioning it. So I just find it so ironic. Yeah, a lot more people questioning it. I know a lot of people still believe it, but I think there are a lot more people questioning it than there ever was.
There's no evidence for evolution. There really isn't. There is evidence for variation within species. We see heaps of that, whether it's like deliberately done with dogs, for example, the whole range of dogs, or whether it happens naturally through change in environment or moving into a new environment, things like that. There is variation within species, there's no evidence that one species became another species anywhere. There's no evidence for it. There's also evidence for similarity of form. So yeah, sure, you can put all these different species there and say, well, this is like this and this is like that, and we're actually more like a monkey than we are like a pig, and we're more like the pig than we are like a jellyfish, for example. But you can put them all in and say, yeah, well, this is like this, and yeah, that's true. You can show there's evidence for similarity of form, but there's no evidence that one species evolved into another species. So it's just an assumption.
It is interesting that the really huge animals occurred in the past. Like the biggest sharks died out years ago, and you've got smaller sharks now. And likewise, you had huge dinosaurs. You don't get huge dinosaurs anymore.
Yeah, there does seem to have been an age of larger creatures that, for one reason or another, became extinct, like the megafauna of Australia, for example. Yeah. There's some things were said. I mean, I think this is slightly on a different subject. We're talking about evolution versus creation more generally. But you talked about variations, about mutations and that. Yes, most mutations are deleterious. The vast bulk of mutations are deleterious. And there's some that are neutral, and there may be 1 in a million sort of thing that's positive. But the vast,
I haven't heard any examples of that. Positive.
Yeah, well, some people might say they're positive. The other thing too is that where you do get mutations, it's always loss of information, not something new. Like the idea that a blind animal suddenly evolves an eye is ridiculous. It just does not happen. But an animal that has eyes could, there might be mutations that, and this has been observed actually, where certain fish have ended up in dark waters in caves and that, or other creatures, over time, there has been a blind fish resulting in that species, or an eyeless fish, but doesn't go the other way. There's no fish that never had eyes that gets eyes. That doesn't happen. But there can be a fish that had eyes that, with mutations and that over time, and because of the particular environment they're in, it might favour, because there's no advantage in having eyesight in a dark cave. They might be better off without eyes, and so that might happen. But there's just nothing. There's no evidence for evolution. It's just widely assumed.
Well, if you don't like the alternative, you have to.
That's right. That's what's driving it. That's actually what's driving it.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter how unreasonable it is. That's the reason. That's why people will pursue that to the nth degree.
You could. I'm being the devil's advocate, but you could argue the other way, that like everybody has some form of confirmation bias. And the worst people are the ones who deny that they do. But like Christians would have a motive for defending their position as well. So they would actually have a confirmation bias or a motive for denying evolutionary theory. The same as somebody who's a naturalist would have a motive for believing in it.
That's why you've got to look at the evidence. So science is supposed to be evidence-based. Well, the evidence points to the fact that life comes from life does not come from non-life, and that one species produces progeny of its own species and not from another. And there's trillions of examples of that, of evidence in favour of those propositions.
Hey, Steve, you mentioned about those left-sided
Amino acids.
Amino acids.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most massive stumbling blocks for the biologists trying to figure out how that happened.
Yes.
And also the carbon, the fact that all life has to be carbon-based.
Yes.
And I think when we get here Hugh Ross next, make sure you ask him about the material on other planets, because I'm sure you would say something like that because Earth was bombarded with so many meteorites and what would you say? Just everything in its early history. There are bits of like fossil records on every planet in our solar system.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm sure that's what you'd say, something along those lines anyway. And that perhaps is the argument as why amino acids exist on other planets.
Yes, yes.
Would he mean by that meteorites hit the Earth and bounced off and took some Earth stuff with them and landed on other planets, or that there were things on other planets that were killed?
No, meteorites bombarded the Earth, and like when the moon was formed, that would have been before that, but yeah, meteorites bombarded the Earth and had such an impact when in some cases 90% of all life died, that bits of material left the Earth and went off into outer space and eventually landed on those places. That's yeah.
Yes. No, thanks, Bronwyn. I agree. We must take that up. Look, I'm certainly convinced, because apart from anything else, as I say, at least 40 amino acids then have to make the simplest of the proteins. Proteins then have to be folded in a very special way, very intricate way, all fit together to make just the simplest of a cell. So, there's all sorts of extra steps that had to occur before the very first simple cell would have to form. And yes, you're right. They're all left-handed. You toss a coin, 40 times, and it all comes down heads. You've just won the jackpot in the casino.
Hmm. There are other issues like that, like the production of matter and antimatter. Like nobody's can explain why matter exists because every experiment gives equal.
Yep, that's right.
Quantities of matter and antimatter, but the naturalists will just shrug their shoulders and say, "Oh, something must have happened."
And more particularly, they just say, with billions of years, I'm sure somewhere in the corner of the universe, eventually, the lucky 40 coins all fell together as all heads, and that's how it happened.
Hmm.
Naturalism of the gaps, as I mentioned a few weeks back.
Hmm.
Well, that's when they start going to the multiverse.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
Anyway.
Right, anybody else like to raise some points?
Actually, somebody's put a comment here. I've just had a chance to look through the chat now that I've finished. Somebody said about whether animals feel guilt. I don't believe animals. Oh, okay. I don't believe animals do feel guilt. So some people say that in relation to their dog, their domestic dog. Oh, the dog looks guilty, or the dog is guilty. Yes, but that's actually projecting a human situation onto it. The dog might have a sense, the dog's got sufficient understanding to know that when it's done something that its owner doesn't like, it's going to get into trouble.
Yeah.
But it doesn't feel guilt. So it might have a
premonition. It's a connection. They know you so well.
Yeah. But they also know that you're likely to find something out. You're not going to like that, and there'll be some negative impact on themselves because of that. They can understand all that, but that's not.
Probably more fear and pleasure.
How different is
certain things happen and they get praise, whereas if you disapprove, you might yell at the dog, rouse at it.
Yeah, and they do understand that. They do learn that. And they live according to that. That's all true, but none of that is guilt. There's not guilt for something wrong that's done.
How do you know?
Yeah, I was going to say that. How do you know?
I have heard dog experts say that sort of thing, that they don't have any such feelings, that if we rouse on a dog, they react because they don't like being roused on, but they've got no idea what it's about.
Right.
And it's also interesting, following on from something that someone else just said, it seems to be more that sort of reaction from pack-type animals than individual-type animals. Yes. So cats, for example, you wouldn't get anything like that at all, but dogs you would, because they're a pack-type animal.
Yeah. They say dogs have masters, but cats have staff.
Yeah.
The purpose of our lives is to serve cats.
Yeah.
Tuppence for your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting point to see. I mean, I know that yeah, there are a lot of very intelligent animals, and it does seem like some of them do sort of seem to go beyond just raw instincts, in a sense that they can. I mean, they've all got character, right? So if you've got a dog, you know, it's got quite a funny character. Well, what is that character?
Mm.
It can't just be a template of a dog, if that makes sense.
Well, there are variations amongst dogs, aren't there? We know the different temperaments of the same species of dog, even dogs in the same litter. And they all learn their pecking order. That's one thing, don't they? That one will end up being the alpha, and others know their place. That all happens naturally in every litter and in every group of animals too, whether if they are a group type of animal.
Okie doke. Has anybody else got any questions or comments?
Nope.
All right, we'll wind it up there. So thank you very much for your presentation. And I think the discussion was quite lively, and I just hope it does benefit us in some way. So thank you for that. Now, as far as next meeting is concerned, I had it up here at one point. Is it you, Steve?
I think it is, yeah. I'll get out the torture rack and show it.
I did have it up here.
Position, look up. Yes. Let me have a look.
Yeah, got it. Yes, the meeting next week is going to be the Spanish Inquisition by Stephen White.
Oh, hence the comment about the torture rack.
Yes.
Yes, so it's going. What do you call it? One of the sexual stimulants was.
Sadomasochism, yeah.
Yes. So we're going to have a bit of that next week.
Yeah. In fact, just correction, Kevin. I hope I haven't overdone it, but I actually start with the Inquisition as a whole. We start with the French Inquisition to start off with, and then the Spanish one.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Oh, it's Inquisitions, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, but it's probably a bit late to change the title, so we'll leave it as it is. But we know where you're going.
Thank you.
Kevin, have we stopped recording?
I can just stop it now.